Welcome back to another episode of Harmonious at Lunch, the show that fuels your business success. I'm Brandon Gano, your host and guide through the world of harmonious business growth. Today, we're unlocking powerful strategies with industry experts to help your business thrive. If you're a business owner, entrepreneur, or executive, you are in the right place. Join me and our incredible guests today on the journey to clarity, growth, and success. It is time to revolutionize your approach to business. Let's dive in with another episode of Harmonious at Lunch. Welcome back into some more bite-sized business advice. And if you've listened to this show for more than 4 seconds, first of all, I'm so sorry to hear that. Just kidding. Thank you for coming back. But you know that we love the topic of harmony. That's why the show is named Harmonious at Lunch. And today's topic, we're talking about work-life harmony, not balance. We're going to get rid of that word. I have a very special guest with me. Welcome to the show, Lance. Thank you so much for being here. How are you?
Oh, I'm doing great. Thanks so much for having me, Brandon. It's a pleasure.
So you are joining me from Colorado, and I must say, it's an absolutely beautiful part of the country. I am jealous. I was just there a couple times last year. It's easy to talk about harmony from Colorado. I think you have nature surrounding you. You could just go out and enjoy nature anytime you want. But I think this is an important topic. And what's your perspective on this difference between work-life harmony versus the balance, like I mentioned before?
Yeah. I think it's easy for us to just latch onto those sort of sound bites and phrases that come out wherever they come from. And we just kind of mindlessly go there. And I was guilty of it too, and the one I'm referring to is like the work-life balance. It was like, oh yeah, sure. On a surface, that sounds actually wonderful, right? We're like, yep, I'm equally balanced. I'm eating an equally balanced diet, and the same thing with my equally balanced daily routine, work life, and all that stuff. But the more I thought about it, I thought about like a vision of a scale would just, as an architect, as a creative, like I can't help but like as soon as I hear something, then and something pops up in my brain visually, and I kept seeing like a scale, and it was a scale of like, well, I guess I'm trading one thing for another, right? So, like, when do you ever have this like perfect balance of, well, I had 50% of my time today was spent with my family and friends and all of that, and then the other 50% was with work. It doesn't really work like that, right? Especially for an entrepreneur. And I think there's probably a big difference too between if you're a business owner and an employee, whether you can have the same sort of like work-life harmony that I'm about to describe. So I was doing a bunch of guesting on shows, and then I started dating this wonderful woman who's also an architect, and I was describing my day one this last summer, just one of my days, and I think she was worried about that, like she was going to start dating this business owner. She's not a business owner; she's just an architect who works for somebody else. That I was going to be this workaholic, and I was like, well, my day was great. Thanks for asking. I went to staff meetings, for a couple hours in the morning, and then I went and jumped on my mountain bike, put my backpack on, and I went for a bike ride for about an hour. Went to visit my 2 community gardens that I have. I have a couple nonprofits, and picked vegetables, and then went back to my house, cleaned them up, ate lunch, went back to work, had some more meetings and other things like that, and then jumped back on my bike, rode to a couple job sites because we're builders too. And I got done to the end of it, and she goes, you have a really you have really good harmony in your life. Like, that's the word I would use. It doesn't seem like you're even balancing. It's just sort of fluid in the way you're operating. And I'm like, you're right. Like, I really like that. I really like that phrase a lot better than work-life balance. And so that's what it means to me. And what I brought this up maybe just a couple weeks ago on a different show, and somebody pushed back a little bit, but I appreciated the pushback. And the pushback they gave me was, they go, well, Lance, you're a business owner, you're an entrepreneur, like you make your own time, your own rules for the most part. What about an employee? Like, can they have that? And I've been thinking about it in the last couple of weeks. And I think part of that is like, if you're an employer like myself, who really is trying to get rid of toxic culture in terms of venerating like working crazy hours, 50, 60 hours a week, especially in the design and the creative world in architecture, that's something that a lot of people are really proud of. Like, they're just proud that they're working 50, 60 hours a week. And I am not like I don't think that's the proper. I mean, life is very short. If there's anything that happened in the last couple of years, with all the pandemic, is like it's pretty obvious life is very short. We should be trying to strive towards living a little bit more and not just being a cog in the wheel. And so when I think about our employees, one of the things we implemented was work from home Wednesday. And I think that's added to their work life harmony. Like I totally acknowledge that I can probably be much more harmonious with my life again because I'm the boss. And so, but how does that trickle down, and how can you facilitate that at your companies in that way? And that's one thing that we've tried to do. We've also just allowed people to come in at certain times that they prefer, right? So some of our two project architects, they'll come in from 7 to 4 each day, whereas the rest of staff actually prefers 8 to 5. And then another example is like we had one of our project architects just had a baby, and there's a 2 week problem area for him and his wife. They can't. Um, the wife goes back to work, and then there's 2 weeks where if they don't have childcare because they're in between when they got on the wait list and all of that other stuff. And I told our project architect, I would go, hey, I wish somebody would have done this for me. And what I'm going to do for you is like, if you want to just work different hours during those 2 weeks and get your work done, in other words, you're taking care of the baby, when wife leaves, comes back home, and then flipped, and then he goes to work at his home office. No problem. That sounds like harmony to me. I'm not even sure you're balancing at that point.
Yeah, I love the perspective. I really want to push back on the pushback though. I find that fascinating. We won't call out that host or that podcast. But that it's funny because that's what we do at HumanOp is we understand the human being, whether it's an employee, the entrepreneur, everything in between. And most people don't take the time to understand who their employees are, so they can't effectively promote harmony. And that's the key difference, where it sounds like you did that with that one quick example of understanding what would drive that person. If you made his life miserable, there's a really good chance in those 2 weeks he's on LinkedIn looking for jobs.
Yeah.
And that's just, it's a small example of what you can do as an employer. But, I believe we all deserve harmony, whether it's employee, entrepreneur. It's going to look different for everybody else. And we can't hold other people's harmony and put that on ourselves and say, well, my life needs to look like that. So based on that, I'm curious from your perspective, do you have these conversations with your staff and help them get closer to whatever their version of harmony is?
Yeah. But then a negative has to happen first, usually. Like it's kind of by default, right? So meaning you could just, when people come into the office, like if one person out of, let's say, our 9 architects that we have comes into the office on like a Tuesday, and you can just feel their aura. I'm not even that woo woo, but like you can feel that negative energy. I mean, just body language or just how their attitude is, right? And that negative energy is like so much stickier than the positive energy. But I'm very grateful for when that stuff happens, because we then realize that, like, well, why is this person not happy? Like, what is going on? And then how can I seek to understand them a little bit better? So, there's 2 things like that I like to point out in that scenario. One is like, that's a really good example of the law of polarity, which I've really tried to lean into in the last maybe 4 or 5 years. And if people don't know what that is like, that's an actual law of physics. So if something negative happens, something positive has to happen to balance it out. It's just like electricity, right? There's a negative and a positive, or it doesn't work in that sort of way. So I've used those instances to really just go sit down with them and say, hey, is everything okay? Like, are we overloading you with work? Is something going on personally? And it's that when you cross that personal threshold, like, you really have to have some empathy involved when you're seeking to understand, right? So I'm a twice divorced, guy, and like, so like, one of the things I'll do is I'll just try to be a little bit vulnerable when I can in those delicate situations, and say things like, hey, is everything okay with your wife or your fiance? I just want to let you know that, like, if there's anybody you ever wanted to talk to personally about that stuff, like, I am a man who has failed twice in life at that. And you can just I'm happy to talk about it. Like, that doesn't mean I'm going to help you solve that problem if it is. Like, I don't have the solutions because clearly I failed, but I can at least just hear you out and empathize with you, with what you're going through. And usually, more often than not, it's actually, there's nothing personal going on. It's just like one or two things at work that is really sticking for them that we need to understand. And a lot of times we'll come out of those meetings of just like maybe offloading a few things from their plate and reassuring them that like, you don't have to do everything. And I think that's probably the biggest problem that we find is like, especially architects, they're so we want to we're kind of control freaks a little bit, but also we just feel like a big personal and moral responsibility for our work. There's people's lives involved, there's a lot of money involved, and so they feel like they got to do everything. And it's, I have to reassure them that like, hey, just so you know, like, we wouldn't even have grown this company to what we have if Alex and I didn't learn how to delegate tasks and let go a little bit. And so we just reassure them that like, this is part of your personal and professional growth in this sort of way. And that's how we usually iron it out.
Yeah. I mean, it's a conversation, right? It's so simple,
Yeah.
yet I think as leaders, we often overlook that. And we have these stories in our head, like, we're putting too much work on them. We're such terrible bosses and leaders. And if you just ask a couple of questions, you can probably resolve most of that. So I love that you take that approach. I do want to revisit, you said in the beginning of the episode, which I think was just so great how you described it, this imagery of balance, right? Where, this same image has popped into my head on this topic, which is if you think about a balance, a scale, like you said, you have two sides that are neither at the maximum or the minimum of where they could be. So if you put, your work life and your home life are the two most common examples. And they're both just mediocre, right? Because they're in the middle. You never experience the high, you never experience the low, which I'm not advocating to experience the lows necessarily, but you do learn from the lows. So there's value there. How do we shift this? How do you shift this to have more of a harmony where you can really experience the fullness of each one, and not just those two, but all the different areas of your life?
Yeah, that's a challenge. I'm glad that resonated with you, because that's exactly where it like leads me to is like, well, I'm just in the middle. That's kind of boring. Like, why can't I be excelling at both at the same time? Right. There's like a couple stories and one example that I feel like really just for me captures the essence of I can do both to their highest limit for myself. And so sometimes like I'll be ice fishing, for example, and I'll have service. So like up in North Dakota, I'd go up for two different trips to go ice fishing every Christmas and Thanksgiving. And there's been multiple times where I've literally been on the phone with somebody at work, could be a potential client, or in this case, it was my like construction superintendent. I was just so happy that how everything was going, and it was sort of our end of the week meeting. And at the same time I'm talking to him, like I'm yanking giant walleyes out of the water. I'm not joking. Like I even have I have a YouTube channel, it's called Fishing with Lance. Like there is one of those episodes where he's on speaker and I'm literally catching walleyes at the same time. I'm like, isn't this the maximum? Like this is the maximum. And I realize not everybody can do that. But for me, that's like one good example. Is just how can you, and I think one of the challenges is like as soon as you get a spouse too. I know this has been a big directional change for me in my current relationship, is like I just try to be overly communicative to Jen and say, hey, I got to take this call. Like we could be on a hike and I'll just flat out tell her like, hey, I have to take this call. Please just bear with me. It's a short call. And I have to, and I'll be walking and talking, whatever, and then it'll be done. But as long as she's aware of the situation, she doesn't feel like I'm not present in that way. I've let her know I am present and conscious of what's about to happen. That's probably another really good example, at least again for me.
Yeah, and that's the part where I think the harmony versus balance comes in, because the balance would say, well, I have to do both at the same time. The harmony says I could just take a little piece of my time and answer that question at work for my staff or whatever, and I can still be fully present with my wife or my girlfriend, my spouse.
Yeah.
And it's a different perspective on it, but it's a key distinction because I don't think you can ever achieve balance. Even if you think, if you were balancing on a board on a ball, you're always making these minor movements, right?
Yeah.
So it's there. We just have to recognize and accept it and not hold ourselves to such an impossible standard. So Lance, I love the perspective. And what I want to know is, because you didn't always have this. I didn't always have harmony in my life. If someone's listening and maybe, they're pre-harmony, let's say, or they fell out of harmony, what would you say, what have you found is maybe the next best step to getting closer to that ultimate state of harmony?
I think it starts with your morning. It really does start with your morning routine. The most successful people that I've interviewed on my show and just been listening to other people and just getting to know other entrepreneurs and successful people, even just successful professionals that work for other people, is their morning. They take their morning routine very seriously. And so for me, I like to call them the golden hours. It's usually before anybody gets up, and I get to watch the sunrise. So there's even at certain periods of the year. So it's like not only a metaphor, but it's real, where I can reset my circadian rhythm. And my routine is like I wake up, big glass of water, get the coffee going, just brewing and everything. And then I go meditate. I go pray. I go stretch, and then come back, put the coffee on, and I spend that next like 90 minutes with no distractions and setting and like goal setting for myself in that day. And it usually starts with me looking at my calendar, kind of making sure I'm ahead of everybody, like prepared for an interview like this, or giving an interview, or meeting with a client, any kind of that stuff. So by the time everybody else wakes up and they start pulling at me, I'm already actually ahead of them and pulling at them. Like I'm never sort of behind the 8 ball. And that's the biggest thing I think you need to set forth in your day, is like, you don't want to be behind the 8 ball. You should really strive to get that good sleep, wake up, have a nice routine, get hydrated, get some exercise, get your mind right. If you're praying, meditating, something like that, there has got to be a little bit of internalness and thoughtfulness, I think. And that's been the most successful strategy for me. And I implemented that about 21 years ago. I'm 42 right now. And when I had my first child, it kind of goes back to this balance versus harmony thing. I was in architecture school, and that's probably not the best idea to have a child when you're in architecture school, which is very intense. And I was like, well, I need to be present after school / work, essentially. And so how do I do that and flip this idea of I need to be in the studio at night? And it was like, I need to be a morning person. Like I need to become this morning person that does all of that stuff ahead of even my child waking up. And I've just carried that through. And that'd be the one big thing, I think, if you're really trying to make a shift towards harmony, is really taking your morning seriously in that way.
I love that tip. That same thing changed my life a number of years ago when I first heard it. The only little asterisk I want to put on that, and I'm curious if you agree or not, at first I thought you had to have this prescription of like, this is the best morning routine. And there's millions of people who have put out those videos and books. Do what's right for you. Find out what resonates with you. It sounds like you agree with that too. So whatever that morning routine is for you, both myself and Lance are huge advocates of creating that space for yourself. So Lance, thank you so much for being here. If the listeners want more info on you mentioned your podcast. Where should people go to listen to that and learn more about you?
Yeah, they can go to InsideTheFirmPodcast.com. We're on YouTube. We are on all of the terrestrial channels like iTunes, Spotify, etc. And I will also link in with anybody. I'm the only Lance Cayko, spelled Lance, last name Cayko, on LinkedIn. Send me a request and I will link in with you.
Awesome. We'll put that in the show notes along with the podcast link down below, wherever you're watching or listening. So you can go ahead and find that out. Lance, thanks again for being here. This was great.
Thanks for having me.
For those of you watching and listening, we hope to see you on tomorrow's episode of Harmonious at Lunch. Thanks for listening to another episode of the Harmonious at Lunch podcast. Make sure you subscribe on whatever platform you're on, and we want to invite you to join us in the Small Business Success Facebook group, our private group where guests and listeners come together to grow your business. We want impact-driven entrepreneurs who are ready to go to the next level in this group so we can all share ideas, collaborate, and grow our businesses together. Go to whatif.com/group, and we want to invite you to join today. See you on the next episode of Harmonious at Lunch.